Hello, I'm Laura with Digital Tutors. In this series of tutorials, we will go through the process to transition from live action footage to a comic-style drawing of a zombie. We start out by retiming our footage to pause on the keyframes that we will use to create the zombie drawings. We then do a quick discussion over the process for doing some drawings of this style in Adobe's Illustrator. However, the drawing process is not step-by-step because we want to focus on the After Effects processes. We then import the drawings into After Effects and begin animating our transitions. We go over creating custom alphas, animating with expressions, and much more to create this animation style. By the end of this course, you will have created your own animated zombie transition, and you'll have picked up some universal tips for creating transitions from live action to animation. So let's go ahead and get started by setting up our main composition and blocking out our zombies poses. In this lesson, we will set up our main composition, get a feel for our live action footage, and begin to block out the poses for our zombie. Okay, so if you're just starting out with us, we are going to be using 02_begin in the After Effects project files, and that's already going to have all of these pieces of assets loaded up over here in your project panel. So to get started, let's go ahead and go to this video folder we have right here, drop that down, and we're going to grab this zombie live action piece of footage right there, and we're going to drop that onto the Create New Composition button right here at the bottom of the project panel. That's going to open this up in a new composition for us, and really quickly I want to go in and just tweak a few of those composition settings. So we'll come up here to composition settings, and I'm happy with the settings that I have up here. We're going to keep that same frame rate at which our footage was shot, but I do want to change my start time code just to a 0, so that's just going to be a little bit easier for us to navigate through. And then I want to change the duration of this composition to 10 seconds. So right now the default duration we have is just the length of time that our piece of footage was. So we're going to do 10 seconds because we're going to be adding more things to this composition besides just the piece of footage. And then up here, I'm going to rename this from Zombie Live Action to Zombie Main Composition. Okay. And now you see that we have a longer composition, and this footage is just sitting right here at the beginning of our comp. So what we want to do is begin to kind of block out some of the most interesting poses that our zombie hits so that we can choose from those for which plates we want to have drawn out that are going to transition us from the live action to the more cell shaded style that we're going to end this composition with. So I want to just scrub through my footage and find the most interesting poses. So I'm going to be looking at the frames over here instead of the seconds. So to view this as frames instead of seconds, just hold down Control and click that timer, and you'll be able to see that in frames now. So let's scrub forward just a little bit. And I really like this pose right here where my zombie has his mouth open and he's kind of leaning forward. So this will be a really good one for the translation of the drawing, and especially the way that the sun is hitting this side of his face. That's going to give us some really nice contrast with the lights and the darks. So I want to go ahead and set a marker on my piece of footage right here. And that's just going to help to remind me exactly which frame I decided to draw. So with my piece of footage selected, I'm going to hit the asterisk key in my number pad. My number pad is going to be the section of keys on the far right hand side of my full keyboard. So I'm not using the numbers along the top, it's the ones at the far right. So you want to make sure you're going to be using a full keyboard for this project as well, just so you can use all those same keyboard shortcuts that I'm using. Okay, let's scrub forward a little bit more and find another pose. Right here is a great one because we are getting this turn. So we're going to be able to see our zombie hitting this pose where he's looking to the right, and then we begin to see the turn. So right here where he's sort of in the middle, frame 53, let's set another marker. So with your piece of footage selected, hit that asterisk key again. And then I'm going to scrub forward just a little bit more right here to frame 64, and that's going to give me kind of this final pose where he's just sort of looking behind him and he's fully turned his head in the other direction. So we'll set another marker here. So I'm setting these markers, and I have about 3 here. So we'll get sort of a stop motion animation kind of look whenever we start transitioning from the live action to our cell shaded style of zombie. And these markers are just going to give us a point of reference for what we want to draw and where we're going to begin to make the cuts to kind of cut this footage together as we begin that transition. So I'm going to draw these frames where we've set the markers for those transitions, and then I'm going to pause my footage or freeze frame the footage so that when I overlay the drawings, the footage isn't moving underneath. So our footage will stop at this point right here, and then we won't pick back up the footage as it's moving. It'll just be another frame once we get to this second marker. So I want to show you how to quickly clip this footage at the points that we've created these markers. So go ahead and put your current time indicator at our first marker, and with your footage selected, I'm going to hit Control, then add Shift to that, and then hit D. And that's going to clip my footage at my marker and duplicate it onto my layer that's right above my first layer that I started with. So it's going to kind of just create a break in time and put it on the next layer right above that. So this is going to make it easier for me to add that freeze frame, but still be able to see the live action up until that point. But before I add that freeze frame, I'm going to move to my next marker, and again, we're going to use that same keyboard shortcut to clip it. So with my current time indicator on my second marker at frame 53, and with my layer 1 selected, we'll hit Control-Shift-D again. And that's just going to do that same thing. And then we'll do this again at our last marker, hitting Control-Shift-D with our current time indicator at the last marker right there. So now you see we have our footage broken up into these 4 little manageable clips. And now what I want to do is, with my current time indicator set at my first marker, I'm going to select this second little clip of footage, and then we'll right click the footage and go to Time, Freeze Frame. And you see that this adds this square marker right there onto my piece of footage. And now what's happening, if I scrub through my footage, is that it's freeze framing on the frame that we set that freeze frame marker. So now as I scrub through, my footage is just pausing right at that point. And then we get sort of this kind of jump as our zombie starts to turn his head. Now I want to set a freeze frame marker on my next piece of footage as well. So I'm going to select that footage, right click it, go up to Time, hit freeze frame again. And now you see we start to get this really blocky look as we scrub through there. And we'll do it again for our last frame as well. So we'll right click, Time, freeze frame. So I'm just going to scrub through there and show you what that looks like now. So we can really easily now begin to overlay the drawings that we'll create, and we're not going to get any kind of movement underneath those drawings of our footage still continuing to play. And now one of the things that I want to do is to kind of regulate or standardize the length of these pieces, because even though we have freeze framed them, they still have different durations. So you see this first one here is a lot shorter than the second and third one. So this first one here, let's just count out the frames and see how long this one is. So an easy way for me to count single frames at a time is to use my page up or page down key. Page down is going to take me forward 1 frame at a time, and page up is going to take me backwards 1 frame at a time, or closer to the beginning. So I'm going to use page down. And it looks like we counted 7 frames. So I'm just going to count forward about 4 frames for this transition because we want it to be pretty quick, and then we'll clip this again. So with my current time indicator here at my first marker, we're going to go forward 4 frames. And then I'm going to simply hold the Alt key and the end bracket. And we see that that clipped my frame right at where my current time indicator is, which usually if your current time indicator is going to be at the beginning of a frame here, we still see the rest of that frame past my current time indicator when we're zoomed in this far. And then when my current time indicator hits the next frame, since there's nothing on my timeline, it's going to show up as empty. So that can be a little bit confusing sometimes just when you're looking at that. You wonder why that wasn't clipped right along the current time indicator, but that's just because the space is actually the duration of the frame, not the point in between those frames. So now we have this lasting for 4 frames, but it's actually looking like 5 if I go forward there. So now let's go ahead and pull this clip back to our current time indicator. So I'm just going to drag that backwards there. And then we'll go forward 4 frames again. And I'm just using that page down key, hit that 4 times, and then we'll hit the Alt N bracket key to clip that. And now you see we have these 2 pieces of footage at the same duration. And then we'll do it one more time for our last piece of footage with our current time indicator there at the beginning of our footage. We'll go forward 4 frames and then hit Alt N bracket again. And now you see that we've clipped those and they are all lasting the same amount of time. So we get this really kind of choppy, quick look where our zombie is just turning his head. But we still get the idea that there is a convincing and realistic looking movement that is being created. So it's not so far apart that we are losing the idea that his head is turning. And now if you feel like these markers are getting in your way and you see too many of them, you can get rid of them by right-clicking the marker and saying delete this marker, or you can just hold Control and click a marker and that will cut it as well. So I'll just go ahead and clip these other markers off of my timeline right there, and I'm going to leave the ones on my main piece of footage just in case I need to refer back to where those frames were at those points. So this is going to be what we base our drawings on, each of the beginnings of these frames. So what I want to do is take a screenshot of each of these points, and then we're going to use those to base that drawing from that. So let's go ahead and kind of scale this up so that I can see my piece of footage a little bit better. And then we'll take a screenshot. Now I'm going to have my After Effects window selected and hold Alt to only take a screenshot of the active window. And then I'm going to hit Print Screen. And that's going to take a screenshot of just that window. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop. And then I will go ahead and go over here to File, New. We'll just say OK to that size, and then hit Control V to paste my screenshot in place. And now let's jump back over to After Effects and take another screenshot of our second frame. So I'll drag this back up just a little bit there, move to that second frame, we'll pull that back down, and hit Alt Print Screen again. And then paste this into our Photoshop document. And then one last time for our last frame, Alt Print Screen, go back to Photoshop and paste. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off the eyeballs on my layer 2 and 3. So I'm looking at this first layer, and then I'm just going to go up here to File and Save As, and we'll save this in our project files as a JPEG. So we'll just go right down there to JPEG, and we'll call this Zombie 1, and we'll save that right there, and we'll use that full quality. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my second layer, just turning on the eyeball so I can see the second layer. And we'll call this one Zombie 2. Save it as a JPEG. And then again for our third layer. And we'll call this one Zombie 3. And now we have 3 JPEG references that we'll be able to base our drawings on. So in this lesson, we set up our composition using our live action plate, and we did a little bit of editing to adjust for the timing of our transition. We also saved out our screenshots that will be the basis for the comic style drawings that we will use in this project. In this lesson, we're going to look at a quick overview of how we would use the screenshots of our footage to construct the comic style drawings in Illustrator. Okay, so I am in 03_begin Illustrator file, which is located in the footage folder in the project files for this course. So I'm just starting out with a blank Illustrator project here, and I'm going to be using a tablet for this lesson, but you can do this part of the project with a mouse. It's just not as easy. So if you don't have a tablet, don't worry, and the files that we're going to be using are already finished and in your project files. I'm just giving you a brief overview of how I would go about drawing these types of translations. So to get started, let's go up here to File, Place. And I'm looking here inside of my project files, and when we saved out the screenshots last time, I went ahead and just moved those into the footage folder of our project files into a folder called Zombie Screenshots. So we can go ahead and look in there, and I'm just going to import this first one for now. So the zombie.jpg for the first zombie, and I'll go ahead and hit Place. And that's going to bring this image onto my Illustrator artboard. And now what I'm going to do is go over here to my layers panel, and I'm going to lock this layer. So I'm just hitting that little lock icon right there because I don't want to move this around at all. Now I'm going to go down here, create a new layer. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, it's laid out a little bit similarly. And now I have this new layer to begin creating my artwork with. So I'm going to push that back over there, and then I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I just hit the Z key, and then I'm going to tap a few times to zoom in there. And the tool that I'm going to be using is the blob brush. So that's located right over here in my tools panel in Illustrator, right under the regular paintbrush tool. The blob brush tool is going to be right there. And I'm going to start out by just painting a silhouette around my figure. So I'm going to be using this kind of light brown color that's just in my swatches right there, right next to those reds, and that's just a default color. And then I'm just going to start painting over my image. And I want to make sure that my color has been selected right there so that it's going to be on top in my Illustrator paintbrush option. So then you'll see that right there is the right color. Okay, so I'm just kind of using my tablet to draw along the edges of my zombie here to create my silhouette. And you notice that Illustrator is pretty smart about smoothing this out for me, and if you want, you can always go in and kind of change those options for what you want the smoothing to be like. You can really fine-tune that. But since this is an After Effects course, I'm not going to go really in depth about how you would go about changing all of these options, because it's likely that you may not end up painting these yourself in a real-world scenario. You might have an Illustrator do it for you if you're just more of an After Effects user. So I'm just going in, painting these out, and filling in that silhouette kind of once I've made this outline here. And if I want to, I can always make my brush a little bit bigger just by changing my wheel option there to increase my brush size. And then I'm just painting to fill that in. And I can hit the spacebar tool there to kind of drag that down. And I'm just doing this really quickly. You could definitely go in and spend a lot more time on this part if you were really doing this for your own project. But the blob brush tool is just a really handy tool inside of Illustrator, so you can quickly create filled vector shapes instead of brush strokes that are just a stroked kind of a line. So if you know anything about Illustrator, that as a tool for creating vector artwork is really powerful. Okay, so now we have sort of this basic rough silhouette laid down. And now I want to go in and start adding some of the details. So I'm going to go back over to my layers panel. I'm just going to bring that out there for a moment. And I'm going to turn off the eyeball that I created there for that base color. And then I'm going to lock that layer because I don't want to mess with that. And then I'm going to create a new layer on top. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer here. And I'm just going to use the default black color. So I'll come over here and toggle this over so the black is my fill, not my stroke option. Change my fill or my stroke to none, so my fill is black. Then grab my blob brush again, and I'm going to use a smaller brush size so that that is just really little there. And then I'm going to just start going in and kind of painting some of these details. Now, this doesn't have to be really perfect because you can go back in with the eraser tool and really start to fine-tune that. So anything you do here is not final. So just kind of come in here and painting along there, creating his hair, and then sort of doing just some little shading along these main areas where I see dark. And then I can come in here and maybe start to do some hatching along this side here and just kind of scraping that along the edge. And really it's okay for this to look pretty rough because our zombie has this really just kind of scary look to him. So it's completely fine for this to look really scratchy and sketchy. And then I can show you really quickly just with the eraser tool kind of how this works. So just with the same layer selected that I was on before, I come over here, grab this eraser, which is right next to the blob tool. Then I can start to come in here and just kind of make these areas a little bit more defined. So this is a great technique, something that I did whenever I was creating the jeans earlier. I'll come in there, grab my blob brush again. I just kind of filled this in, this whole area here, with the blob brush and just did a really quick sort of sketchy outline of the jeans. And just really, really rough. And then I came in with the eraser tool and sort of did a reverse kind of look to create the lighter parts of the jeans. So you get this kind of a style where the dark is actually not creating those main strokes that you would see in maybe more of this style up here that you'd be a little more default to. So whenever I'm looking at these two layers combined, which right now I don't have all my details drawn out at all, I'm going to turn back on my under layer. You kind of see the way that those two are combining together. Now let's go over here to the zombie translations.ai file, which this is located in your project files. We'll zoom in a little bit and just kind of see how these turned out. Now, not zoom in quite that far. As you can see, this is really rough as well. I used definitely a smaller blob brush than what I was using in this really rough version where we're just kind of showing you how that worked. But it's again just a really sketchy translation, but when it's all zoomed out, you really just get the feel for those poses that we took the screenshots of when we were in After Effects. So let's talk really quickly about the way that these are laid out on their respective layers. So we see over here in our layer panel that we've got these 4 main layers here. And if I turn off those eyeballs, you can see which ones those go to. So inside of this first layer here, I've got lots of little sub layers. So I've got that under color there that's at the bottom, and then the black layer that's on top of that. And it's okay that these are layers just with the regular numbers as long as they're inside of a main layer that's going to be visible here in my layer panel. And this, I'm explaining it in this way just so that you can see the way that they're laid out for whenever we import these to After Effects. Now, After Effects is going to be able to recognize which layers we have set up here in Illustrator and then import those as a composition, and we'll be able to see these individual layers as layers we can use on our timeline in After Effects. So as long as I have everything I want to animate separate, then I can import that to After Effects and animate it without having to save each one out as an individual file. So this arm layer that I have right here, you may notice is a little bit different than the third screenshot that we actually took. And just took a little bit of liberty with changing the way that this was set up so that maybe in After Effects we can animate this arm at the end a little bit separately from the actual zombie. So maybe we'll just kind of do the same stop motion sort of transition that we have for these first two, but then this third one we can have a little bit of fun with doing some animation with this arm. So I definitely want that arm on its own layer inside of Illustrator. Okay, so in this lesson, we took a quick look at how the screenshots could be used to construct the artwork and also discussed how the layers need to be set up for easy import into After Effects. And with that, now we're ready to import those layers in our next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to import our zombie drawings into After Effects and place them in our scene. Okay, so we're right here where we left off in lesson 2, just after we had taken those screenshots, and this is saved as 04_begin. So if you didn't do that first part, we're starting out right here. And now we're ready to import the zombie translations that were created in Illustrator. So just go over here to your project panel, right click, go to Import, File, and we're going to navigate to our project files into the footage folder. I'm just going to scroll down here and go to zombietranslations.ai, and then where it says import as, we're going to import that as a composition. Now come over here and hit open. And we see that this created the zombie translations composition for us, and then it also imported this folder with the zombie translations layers. Now, I'm not actually going to be using the zombie translations composition because I'm just going to use the layers that we created individually. So if you want to, you can go ahead and delete that composition. It really just looks like a composition with a transparent or black background, since our After Effects backgrounds are black for this composition, and we just see all 3 of those zombies that we created as they were in Illustrator. So we're not going to be using that. You can go ahead and delete it. And now we're back here to our zombie main composition, and I want to go ahead and overlay the zombie translations that we created. So I'm just going to select all 4 of those layers and drop them onto my composition. Okay, so let's go ahead and see which one we have selected here. So this is going to be this middle one. So I'm just going to put the layer on top of my middle piece of footage right there. And I'm just going to kind of arrange these so it's a little bit easier for me to use. And then if we need to reorder them in a moment, we can do that. So this one's going to be my first pose. So I'll put that on top of my first piece of frozen footage. And then these 2 layers right here are going to be my third and final pose with the arm kind of separated from my zombie there. Okay, so let's kind of zoom in on our timeline a little bit here just so I can see this a little bit better. And what I want to do is go ahead and clip these layers just so they only last as long as the piece of footage that I'm looking at. So with my first layer selected right there, which is my zombie kind of looking over here to the side, I'm going to hold down the Alt key and hit the begin bracket key, which in the lesson 2 that we looked at, we use that with the end bracket key. So this is just clipping it from the other direction. And now let's go ahead and place this zombie right on top of our live action zombie. So he's going to kind of end up right here. So we see that as that move happens, it changes to our translation of our zombie. And I'm also going to clip my zombie layer of the translation at the end. So just with my current time indicator right before that last frame, or just as that last frame begins, we'll hold down Alt and hit the end bracket key. And that's going to trim that to that same length. Now let's do this for our second pose. So we'll just select our layer with our current time indicator at the beginning of that clip and hit Alt begin bracket, and then move to the end and hit Alt end bracket just to clip that again. And then we'll do it again for our last piece of the puzzle here with our last zombie pose. Select both of the layers for his arm and his body, and we'll Alt begin bracket to clip that. And then I'm actually not going to clip this again here at the end because this is the translation that we're going to use to carry us through the rest of our scene. So now let's go ahead and place our second pose just right on top of our zombie right there, and you can zoom in if you need to see that a little bit better. So we kind of get this movement just like that. And then I'm going to select both of these layers. I'm just holding Shift to select both of those and place him in place right there as our last piece. And I'm going to go ahead and move his arm kind of into place just right there on his body so that we can have that work for us until we decide to animate it. And one thing that I want to do now is just pre-compose these two layers together so that anything that I would change as far as animating this zombie is going to happen to the zombie as a whole with his arm. So we're almost going to just create a container that will hold his arm and his body as one. So go ahead and Shift select both of those layers, and then I'm going to hit Control Shift C to bring up my pre-composed dialog box, and we'll just call this Zombie 3 and say OK to that. And that's going to give us this pre-composed layer. Now let's go ahead and go inside of that pre-comp, and with our current time indicator there at the beginning, we'll go ahead and trim this just so that it begins at the same point that we clip those layers to. So go ahead and bring your work area right there to our current time indicator, right click the work area and hit trim comp to work area. So that's just going to take that space away that you had there at the beginning. Now go back out to our main composition and we'll just drag this into place so it's beginning at the same place as our piece of freeze framed footage. Now just so we can keep this a little more straight, let's go ahead and change the colors of these layers to a completely different color. So if we need to quickly look at the drawing we have that is referring to any one of these three drawings of the zombies, we'll be able to find it quickly. So just come over here where you see this little tag in your columns here on the timeline, click that and let's choose yellow, and we'll just name all of these yellow that we are going to be using as those pieces of zombie drawings. So that's just going to be a little bit more recognizable, and even though this one is pre-composed, now we'll be able to easily refer to it on our timeline. So right now, as I'm scrubbing through this, I don't want it to look like such a pop whenever we're moving through our footage and he just kind of pops on there. So I'm going to create a custom alpha to reveal my zombie, and we can use that same alpha to end up revealing sort of a grungy texture in the background as we begin to transition from this pretty nice looking day of a live action plate to something that looks really grungy and more scary to go along with our zombie. So in this lesson, we imported our zombie drawings and placed and timed them with the footage in our scene. In this lesson, we will learn how to create a custom alpha to use as a reveal for our background and our zombie. Okay, so I'm going to create this custom alpha in a new composition. So you can just do that from the After Effects project you already have open. Come over here and just click this Create a New Composition button. And I'm just going to use these same settings that we used for our last composition, but I'm going to call it Basic Reveal. Then we'll say OK. And that just creates a new blank composition for us. So let's go over here and add just a plain white solid to our composition. So come up here, go to Layer, New, Solid. We'll change this to white. Okay. And now we're going to add an effect to give us a kind of noise effect. So let's go ahead and open up our effects and presets panel. So we'll go over here to Window, Effects and Presets, and that's going to open that up over here. And the effect we're going to use is turbulent noise. So go ahead and type in, you can just type in noise if you want. And that's going to bring this noise and grain option up for you. And you have lots of different ones to choose from. We're going to choose turbulent noise. Just grab that effect and drop it onto your white solid. And you see that you get this kind of cloudy look. So if you know anything about alpha channels, you are basically using the contrast between the black and white to reveal different parts or hide different parts of an image based on the way that you combine the alpha channel with whatever image you're trying to hide or reveal. So we're trying to operate under the assumption that if we want something to be fully revealed, we either need it to fully go to black or fully to white, and then in between we'll kind of have a little bit of both. So I want to sort of fade on that zombie in kind of just a spotty way and give it just kind of a grungy, scary sort of look. So I'm going to change my turbulent noise effect to start out looking one solid color and then end up as a different solid color. So I'm going to turn up the contrast in my turbulent noise effect, and for now I'm just going to leave the fractal type and the noise type to what they come with just at the default. So let's turn up our contrast. I'm just going to turn it up all the way there so that I get a really contrasty image. So my blacks are totally black and my whites are totally white. And that's just going to give me a little bit more of a kind of solid edge there for using this alpha. So then we're going to come over here to our brightness. And for this first part, as I said, I'm going to turn this all the way up so that my brightness is causing this to be completely white. So we'll start out with our image not being revealed at all. So we'll use a track matte type that says anything that's white, don't show, or don't show anything behind an image that is going to be white. So we'll learn a little bit more in a moment about how that track matte works. But for now, we're just going to keep in mind that we want it to start out completely solid white. So I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe with the brightness set to making this image completely white. So I'll just come over here, and with my current time indicator at the very beginning, we'll set our stopwatch for brightness. And I do want to make sure that I have that allow HDR results checked, which is what it's defaulting to, but that's also going to just give me a better alpha channel to use for this particular kind of reveal that we're going to be creating. And I also am going to kind of scrub forward a little bit here, and then let's just go ahead and turn this brightness back down so that I can start to see what that image will look like. And maybe we'll turn up our complexity a little bit. So you see that just gives us a little bit more definition around the edges there. And I want this to last for probably somewhere around 75 frames. And if that's maybe a little bit too long or too short, we can always stretch this alpha channel to be longer or shorter once we bring it into our main composition. But let's go ahead and look at the keyframes we have set. So I'm going to select that layer and hit the U key to bring those up. And earlier, whenever I changed that brightness, it just set another keyframe at that point. So I'm going to drag this over here and set this keyframe at my current time indicator. And now let's actually just go ahead and continue to turn that brightness down all the way so we get a completely black image. And that's going to just be the opposite of what we started out with. So we kind of get this sort of dissolving effect where it dissolves from completely white to completely black. So now with my current time indicator there kind of in between those two keyframes, I'm going to be able to sort of tweak what this looks like. And another thing that I can do is maybe key the evolution of this. So you see that if I kind of turn this here, this sort of just makes it kind of boil around there. So if you want to, you can put your current time indicator at the beginning, set a key for the evolution, then move forward and just kind of give that a little bit of a change there. So now we see that as that changes in brightness, it's also evolving and moving around. So that just gives it a little bit more complexity. So that's just kind of an interesting way to create this alpha channel, and that's really it. That's a really easy way just to do this basic sort of reveal, and we're going to be able to use this in a couple different ways. So in our next lesson, we'll talk about how to use this alpha to reveal our zombie and our background. In this lesson, we will talk about how to change our background over time and how we will use that custom alpha we created in the last lesson to reveal a grungy texture. Okay, so we're right here where we left off when we created our custom alpha. And really quickly, I just want to move over here to our project panel and organize this a little bit better. So After Effects has been putting our compositions into this video folder, and I want to move them into my comps folder. So go ahead and shift select these two right here that are next to each other, drop those in your comps folder. Move this one in there as well. We'll leave this piece of video in our video folder, and then I'm just going to drag this zombie translations layers folder and move this into the graphics folder. So that's just going to keep us a little more organized over here on the left. So let's move back out to our zombie underscore main composition on our timeline. And something that I want to do over time here is just darken up my footage and just maybe make it a little bit prettier here at the beginning as well. So I want to pre-compose my footage into one layer to add that effect. So go ahead and shift select those two clips of footage there at the bottom, and then hold Control just to click these other two pieces of footage and add them to your selection. Then we'll go ahead and hit Control-Shift-C to bring up our pre-composed dialog, and we'll just call this live footage. Okay, and then I'm going to just drag that live footage to the bottom of my stacking order there on my timeline. And now I want to add the curves effect to this piece of footage. So if you don't already have your effects and presets panel open over here on the right, you can come over here to Window and choose effects and presets right there. Make sure that box is checked, and that's going to open up that panel for you. Okay, so in this box right here, I'm just going to type in curves. And that's going to bring up the color correction for me, and curves is what I'm going to use. So go ahead and grab that and drop that onto your live footage. And now I'm going to go ahead and move my current time indicator just right there to where that transition is going to start, because in a moment we're going to set a keyframe there. And for now, I'm just going to kind of brighten this up a little bit just by grabbing this line and pushing that upwards. And then we'll grab it down here at the bottom just to sort of make a really subtle S shape and really pop those blacks out a little bit better, just to make this a little more contrasty and interesting. So this whole beginning part of our footage right there is just going to be a little more contrasty. And then with my current time indicator, again, just right here where the transition begins, I'm going to go ahead and set a key here with the curves effect. So go ahead and hit your stopwatch, and then just to view that key on your timeline, select your live footage layer and hit the U key to bring that up. We'll see the key right there on the timeline. And now I'm going to scrub forward, and as I begin to transition, I'm going to make this piece of footage get a lot darker. So just come over here to your curves effect and pull this lower part of the S down so we start to get just really, really dark blacks. And it's totally fine that you start to get this kind of noise effect on your road, because we're going to add so many effects on top of this piece of footage. By the time it gets this dark, it's not going to be really recognizable even. So that's completely fine if it's looking like this. And if you want to, you can go into your live footage pre-composed layer and go ahead and just extend out this top piece of footage, which is the last pose that our zombie hits, just so if it ends a little bit abruptly, we still have a few frames to work with before that transition is completely finished. So that's just optional, just depending on where you end up setting that keyframe for the curves. So I'm going to X back out of these, go back to my zombie main composition, and now I'm ready to add that grunge layer and the alpha channel that we were talking about earlier to reveal it. So let's go back up to our project panel and go to our graphics folder, And we'll just kind of scroll down through here. And the texture that we're going to be using is the rusty metal texture. So go ahead and grab that and just drop it onto your timeline right above the live footage layer. So it's going to look like this. Now we'll zoom out of this a little bit, and I'm just going to scale this down. Still giving myself a little bit of margin for error there around the edges, but that's just going to make it fit our comp size a little bit better. And I'm also going to drag the edge of this layer in so that it begins right at the same frame as my transition. So it looks a little bit like this. Now let's go to our comps and grab that basic reveal comp that we created earlier. So I'm going to twirl this graphics folder back up, twirl down comps, and grab basic reveal. Now let's drop this right above the metal layer that we just added. So it's going to look something like this. And then we'll drag this one forward as well, so they're beginning at the same frame. So this is what your timeline should look like. And this is what it looks like if we scrub it. Okay, so now we need to set this up as a track mat. So to do this, we want to have that column open here on our timeline. So right click over here on any one of these columns. I'm just going to hover over parent, right click, go to columns, and choose modes, which is right in between switches and parent. And that's going to bring up your blending modes and your track mat options. So the track mat that we're going to choose is going to be this bottom one here, the Luma inverted mat. And that's just because we began our alpha channel on white. So when I choose that, we see that we go back and we're able to see our footage right from the start there. But as I scrub forward, we see that this begins to reveal itself, this piece of grungy texture that we've created. So this is just a really interesting way for us to reveal our grungy piece of texture that kind of goes along with the texture itself, sort of this oxidized metal look here. And we also just have a more interesting look than what a plain mask would look like that we were just expanding. So this is just another way to reveal something like this. Now, one of the things I'm noticing is that this starts a little bit late, and it also lasts a little bit too long. So we're already almost all the way to frame 125 by the time this ends. So I want this to be a little bit shorter, this basic reveal. So to do that, I'm going to just stretch this layer down. So we'll come over here to our columns, right click, go to columns, and come all the way down to stretch. And that's going to give you these values right here. So what I want to stretch is my actual alpha channel. So go ahead and select that layer just to make sure you're on the right one. It's going to be the one that the eyeball has been turned off for, and that just happens whenever you change this track mat mode right here. So you don't need to turn that back on. You didn't accidentally click that. That is how it's supposed to look. Okay, so come over here to your stretch column. We're just going to stretch this down, stretch this backwards here. And I'm going to do it to somewhere right around 17% right there. So now we see as I stretch this, or as I scrub this, this reveals a lot more quickly. And that's a little bit closer to what we're going for as far as the duration of that change. Okay, so another thing I want to have happen is that I want the entire background to get a little bit darker, even on top of the curves effect that we added. So let's go over here to our graphics folder again. Drop this down, and I'm just going to choose that zombie background.psd, and you can see up here in the thumbnail that this is just kind of a nebulous looking background that's just a few colors all blended together. So go ahead and grab that, and we're going to put this behind our live footage layer. And if you want to, you can go ahead and pull this layer forward just so that it's beginning at the same frame as everything else. Now, you don't have to do that, but sometimes it's a good indicator just visually for whenever all these things are happening together. And now what I want to do is to turn the opacity of my live footage down over time. So go ahead and click that live footage, hit the T key to bring up the opacity, and we'll just start it on this first frame of the change, and we'll turn this all the way, or first we want to just set our keyframe at 100% so that we don't see a pop here. So it's just kind of sitting there at 100 and then begins to change. But then as it moves, we'll turn the opacity down so that we start to see that background through our piece of footage. So we'll turn this all the way down to 0. And now we just need to decide where we want this keyframe to actually go. So we'll drag this out a little bit, and let's look at the keyframes that we have created inside of our basic reveal. So it looks like we're sitting at about 75 right there. So now we can come back out to our main composition. That's where this transition is ending. And even though we have this shrunk down to 17, that is going to translate out here on the outside. So we want this last keyframe right there on the 0 is going to be the same point when this transition for the grunge layer has finished. So it looks something like this. So you can kind of begin to see that even though that background is getting darker over time with the curves, we also are seeing that pinkish look behind that layer as well. So that just adds one more layer of complexity to this image that we're creating. And another thing we can do is change the blending mode of our grunge layer. So I can come in here, select the grunge layer, and come over here to my blending mode, not my track matte mode. It's going to be the one right to the left of that track matte. Drop this down and we can change this to something like overlay. So now we have this sort of a look where this is really blending with our background nicely. We can kind of see through there, and it's just really starting to come together to look like one piece. So we're going to be adding a lot more layers to this to continue to just finish out this transition. But for now, we're getting a pretty fluid transition as far as moving from our live action footage to our zombie translation. So in this lesson, we created a shift in our background from our footage to our grungy looking background. In this lesson, we'll use that same custom alpha we used to reveal our grunge texture in the last lesson to reveal our zombie. Okay, so we're right here where we left off, and just as I'm scrubbing this, I still feel like this looks a little bit like too much of a pop to go from this piece of live footage to our drawing. So I want to use that same alpha channel that we created to reveal my zombie. So I want to do it over the course of these two drawings here, so zombie 1 and 2. And then by the time we get to zombie 3, which is this last pose, I want him to be completely revealed. So to use that alpha channel, I need to have both of my layers combined into one layer so that the alpha channel will recognize them as one piece of footage. So go ahead and shift select both zombie 1 and 2 layers, which are these two yellow layers right here, and then we'll hit Control Shift C to pre-compose those together. And we can just call this zombie 1 and 2. And I want to go ahead and, because this pre-comp was created to be the entire length of my composition, I'm going to go inside of that pre-composed layer and just trim it to the duration of my 2 clips. So with my current time indicator right there at the beginning of this little clip, I'm just going to hit the B key, and that is going to snap the beginning, B for beginning, of my work area to this part of my footage. And then we'll move to the end, and it's going to actually be right here on the end, and hit the N key, and this is also going to snap to the end. And if you want that to be right up next to the layer, you can always trim those in a little bit closer there. Okay, so now with our work area trimmed in, we'll go ahead and right click that and click Trim Comp to Work Area. And then that's actually going to give us the length that we're looking for. Okay, so come back out here to our zombie main composition, and we'll just drag this little pre-comp that we've created now right to the beginning of all of our other layers. And that's another great reason to be clipping these layers and making them begin exactly where you want them to, just so that you kind of are using your layers as an indicator of when things are happening in your composition. And again, I'm going to change the color of this layer to yellow just so it's a little more recognizable. So click this tag and click yellow there, just so that those are matching still. And now I'm going to use that same alpha channel that we used in the last lesson to reveal my 2 clips here. So go ahead and come over here to your comps, grab your basic reveal comp, and put this right on top of zombie 1 and 2. So we get something that looks like this. And right now this looks a little strange, so that's not exactly what we're doing, but we're going to tweak this. So go ahead and, just as we did before, drag your basic reveal to begin at the same point as your zombie 1 and 2 layer. And we can go ahead and stretch this right now to only last the length of the zombie layer. So we get this kind of a look. So it's happening a lot more quickly. This is actually only about 5%, and we can tweak this in a moment if we feel like that is too quick for us. So now let's go ahead and change the track matte of our zombie 1 and 2 layer to the same that we changed it for our grunge layer. So that's going to be Luma inverted matte. So now as I am scrubbing this, we see that our zombie is sort of dissolving on as we move through. So that's a lot more interesting looking than what we had earlier. And just to maybe change that a little bit further, I can kind of squeeze this in here and make this layer fit a little bit better on my zombie. So instead of being the whole size of my composition, now that alpha channel is just fitting right on top of the zombie drawing. So that's just going to maybe just make it not line up with the larger dissolve of the grunge texture just right on top of each other like that. And again, you can maybe zoom into your timeline there a little bit, and if you feel like this is happening too quickly, you can stretch that out a bit so it happens over a little bit longer amount of time. And we still want to be able to see a lot of our last layer, so again, you can just go in there and tweak that until you think it looks about right. So really for me, about 15% I think looks pretty good. So that dissolve is happening at that speed. And then when we get to the third zombie, it's completely revealed, and that's why we're not using that track matte at that point. So we didn't pre-compose the zombie 3 into the basic reveal, because at this point we want to be able to see the entire image. So that was pretty simple. Just now that we kind of know how those alpha channels work, you can use them later on in this project, and hopefully you can figure out some interesting ways to use alphas to reveal other things in the rest of your projects as well. So in this lesson, we learned how we can reuse our custom alpha to reveal our zombie. In this lesson, we want to talk about how to arrange some blood splats to create a textured backdrop for our zombie. Okay, so I want to create a sort of bloody backdrop that shoots out from our zombie when the transformation from live footage to the comic drawing is complete. And first, I have to get the blood just into the general setup that I want to place behind my zombie. And I'm going to do that with all of the blood splats over here in my graphics folder. So come over here to graphics, and we see all of these blood splatters here, 1 through 19. So these are going to be the ones that we're using, and those have just all been created in Illustrator. They're easy to create just using some of the brushes that come inside of Illustrator's brush library. So to get started with these, I'm going to create a new composition. So I'm just going to push this button right here, create a new composition, and we'll use all those same settings that we have been using so far, but I'm going to just call this blood splatters. And then we're going to drag these blood splatters 19 through 1, all of these here, onto the timeline. So just shift select all of those and drag them down there. And it may take a second just for these all to load up. And at first they're all going to be loaded on top of each other like that. So now all I'm going to do is just to begin resizing and placing these splatters into a kind of a look that maybe originates from this point in my composition right here and then just kind of moves out from there in all directions, almost just like an explosion. So I'm going to be using the rotation tool a lot just to kind of rotate these around, and I'm also going to be scaling them up just to get them into place and get them looking the way that I want them to be. So there'll be just a lot of different kind of tools that I'm using here, just between the rotation and scaling them up. And really this is just up to you. This is just, you're just placing these files in a way that you find to be visually appealing. So there's really no particular way that they have to be. We just want it to look convincing, like it's actually all originating from the same point. So you see how I'm kind of working out from the center point that I've chosen right there, and then just moving them from there. So I'm rotating that just so the end of those points is all coming from the same area. And if you feel like it's too much for you to handle to drag those all onto the timeline at once, you could just move them in one at a time. It's really just up to you how you want to work. So we'll just pull that one in as well. And we have a lot of different kinds of splatters here, so I'm just sort of trying to keep it interesting with the way that I'm arranging them, so not too many right next to each other. So we kind of have this interesting one with this sort of curly edge right there, and I'm just going to move this one that's pretty similar to that to a different area of my composition, just to keep it interesting and different. And it's okay if the ends of these extend off of the edge of your composition, because we're going to be changing this in a moment to where we can see those edges if they come inside of the main edge of our other composition, our other main composition that we'll be bringing this into in a moment. Now this is an interesting piece right here. This one almost just looks like a smear, so I really want to make this one big and apparent and move this just right on top there. And now that I have kind of a few layers sort of overlapping here where I had all of my others at this point, so I'm going to move down and actually just lock that layer that I just now moved on top of that point, just so that I can still get to the rest of these. And maybe I'll put this one up here in the corner, so this is just almost like a secondary place where I'm getting another kind of splatter. And maybe I'll move this one over here in the corner as well, maybe up in this direction here. So this configuration is just really up to you. This one as well could be one that happens up in the corner area instead of just originating from this other point. And again, I'm just rotating it a little bit differently than I rotated this one earlier, just to add variety. So this is definitely up to you exactly how you want to change these. You can spend as much or as little time as you want just arranging these on your composition, and you don't even have to use all of them. We have 19 here for you to choose from, but if you like one look better than some of the looks of the others, maybe you just want to change it up a little bit. And here's some sort of droplets that I have, so maybe I put these up in this other corner here. And it looks like we almost have all of them. This one is kind of interesting. Maybe we'll add this just like we had sort of at the beginning when we had more of those longer streaks. Scale that up a little bit. And just about finished. Now here's some more droplets, and I'm going to scale these up and actually put them down here in this lower left-hand corner just to sort of balance that out a little bit. And then this one we can maybe just place right here in the middle of all of that there at the bottom. And that's looks like that's just about all of the pieces. Maybe move this one as well up into this upper left corner. So now we kind of have a composition that looks like this, and really this is up to you exactly how you want to arrange these, but for the most part I'm just going for something, as I said earlier, that's just originating from this center point right there. So something else that I want to do is I want to make sure that my continuously rasterized switch is turned on for all of these, because I scaled most of them up past 100. They are vector layers, so my After Effects will be able to recognize those vector edges and recalculate them so that none of them are blurry. So we'll go ahead and unlock that one layer that we didn't want to accidentally click, and just go ahead and check this continuously rasterized switch for all of our layers. So just make sure you have that turned on for all 19 layers so we're not missing any. And you can see up here now this looks just a little bit more crisp. So in this lesson we arranged our blood splats in a way that they are now ready to be animated. In this lesson we will animate our blood splats. So I'm going to be animating these blood splats so that at the beginning I can't see them at all, and they'll be really small, just all here kind of in the center, and then I want them to shoot out from this center point that we've sort of created with the setup that we've made for them. So I'm going to be changing the scale, but I also need to change where the anchor point is originating from, because right now the anchor point is going to be in the middle of all of these layers. So if I just select one here, we see that that anchor point is right there. So right now if I change the scale of this layer, you can see as I drag that, it gets smaller and larger right from that anchor point. But if I move the anchor point to this middle area where I want it to originate from, it's going to scale from that point. So it'll scale out, which is the kind of animation that we're looking for. So because I have so many layers, I'm going to be using the solo switch just to make it a little bit easier for me to keep track of. So for now, I'm just going to solo one layer at a time. Just start here with this top layer and begin moving my anchor point. So to do that, I'm going to use the pan behind anchor point tool. So I'll just select that and click my layer so I can see the anchor point. And then just with that tool selected, I can move the anchor point there to the middle. And now I can go ahead and set up my scale keys. So I'm going to go ahead and, with my layer selected, hit the S key to bring up my scale percentage. And I will go ahead and set a key at the percentage that my blood splat is at right now. But because this is the size I want it to end up at, I want to go ahead and just move that key forward in time. And I probably want this to happen over about 7 frames. So I actually only want to move it forward 7 frames. So let's go ahead and count that out from the beginning of our current time indicator using the page down key. So I'm just going to hit the page down key 7 times. And then we'll set this keyframe right on top of our current time indicator there at the 7th frame. And you could also come over here, just click this and type in 7 if you wanted to do it that way without using the page up or page down keys to navigate. Now let's move our current time indicator back here to the very beginning, and I'm just going to type into my scale right there by clicking it and hitting 0. So we sort of get this kind of an animation. And you can see that because we moved that anchor point, it's scaling from that origination point that we were talking about designating with the anchor point moved there to the middle. Okay, so now that I've done this one pretty slowly, walked you through those steps, I'm going to go through and do it a little more quickly for the rest of my layers. So I'm going to unsolo that layer, then solo my next layer. Hit the S key to bring that scale up, and now that I have that second keyframe set, I know where I want to set that scale key, so I can go ahead and just hit the stopwatch with my current time indicator hovering over that point, then move back to the beginning and type in 0. So I'm doing this, and as you can see, we didn't move that anchor point, so that is scaling from the wrong place. So I can just do that now with my current time indicator at that final keyframe. Go ahead and grab that pan behind tool and move this to the beginning, so we have this kind of a look. Okay, so now we'll move on to our next layer and make sure to remember to move the anchor point. And you can really just start to move through here really quickly, and without really having an idea of actually what your animation is going to look like, you can animate just using these values, and it's going to give you a consistent look between all your different layers. So just kind of an interesting way to do it, rather than changing one thing, then doing a RAM preview, then changing again. And this is definitely going to save you some time in the long run just by doing it this way. So down here, we'll do this next one. Just I'm twirling these layers back up as I'm working, just to kind of save me some space on my timeline here, because I am just sort of working in a smaller area, and you want to just stay organized as you do this. And it really doesn't matter the exact order that you do this in. You just want to make sure that you are on one of the keyframes that you will be setting whenever you move the anchor point. So it doesn't have to be in a particular order of operations for it to work properly. You just want to make sure you're at the right point in time. So hopefully you can kind of start to get an idea as I move through here. Make sure that's on that first keyframe there, of what this is looking like as I kind of scrub that. We're sort of just getting this explosion look right there, and it happens over such a short amount of time. You don't really have to worry about it not being convincing or anything like that, because it's going to just happen so fast that you won't even be able to tell that it's just getting bigger and that it's not actually shooting out or changing. So we're about halfway through these layers here, and definitely you could just move through. And once we start to get to some of the layers that are not the long streaks, we probably don't need to worry about moving the anchor point. So like this one here, because it's more of just a circular kind of shape, I'm not going to worry about moving the anchor point to this sort of origination point. And again, with this spot pattern that we have right there, this one is going to be fine just to leave the anchor point where it's at. So that's just something to keep in mind. You really only need to change that for those layers that are going to be more of a long streak kind of a shape. And notice that I'm trying to always set the second keyframe first, and that's just because I've already changed the scale to be the scale that I'm wanting for my composition to look right in the end. So that's just saving me a little bit of time, rather than scaling it down to 0 and then scaling it back up. Okay, so I've gone ahead and finished up that scale animation for the rest of my layers, and I'm just going to hit the 0 key on my number pad just to kind of watch what that looks like, so you can kind of see that a little bit better. Maybe this layer right here we want to rotate a little bit, just now that we can see how that's looking, and maybe just rearrange that a little bit. And now what I want to do is, with all of these scale keys set, I want to move to the very end of my timeline and scale a few of them up and then maybe a few of them down, just to add a little bit more interest to my animation. So as time continues to move on, we'll be able to see a little bit more of a change in animation. So with my current time indicator there at the very end, I'm just going to drag up this scale key, and you can see that this layer continues to get a little bit bigger. And now maybe this next one I want to get a little bit smaller. So it's just going to depend on really what you want it to look like. And I'm doing them individually just because I want to really be able to control what this ends up looking like. But if you wanted to, because they're all at different scales, you could select more than one at a time. So maybe I'll select all 3 or 4 of those layers and then drag the scale key up for all of them, and it's just going to scale them and give me keyframes for all of them. We'll come back over here to our blood splatters comp. And then I'm just moving through here and quickly changing those. Now, I do want to go in and change a few of them to scale down over time, just to give me a little bit more of an interesting look. So they'll kind of explode out from the middle, and then a few of them will get smaller. So just a little bit more interesting than if they all get bigger at the same time. Okay, with this new little bit of animation added, let's go ahead, and I just have selected all those layers. I'll hit the S key again just to twirl that back up and consolidate our timeline a little bit. And now I'm going to hit the 0 key on my number pad, and we can just watch this animate through and see what that last keyframe did to that animation. So again, some of these will be getting a little bit bigger over time, and as you can see, it's really subtle. It's just really slowly getting bigger, and that's what we want. We don't want it to overpower what's happening with our zombie. We just want it to kind of have a little bit of residual animation in the background. Okay, so now we can watch that RAM preview through, and as you can see, it almost gives the effect that a few of these are closer to the camera than the ones that are getting smaller. So these here look a little bit closer as they continue to grow, and it just gives us an interesting sort of composition. Now, I want to change the interpolation of these keyframes just a little bit. So again, I'm going to select all my layers, hit the S key to bring that up, and now I'm just going to select all my keyframes just by dragging a box around all of them, and then I'm going to hit the F9 key to set those to easy ease, and that's just going to give me a little bit of interpolation where at the beginning they're going to kind of slow into that animation, and then here at the end they will slow out of it. Now, because this keyframe happens so quickly, I want to use the interpolation from my very last keyframe and my very beginning keyframe to affect this one. So with all of this second keyframe on all your layers selected, hold the Control key and then just click one of those, and that's going to change it back to a linear key. Then we'll click it one more time, and that's going to change it to an auto Bezier keyframe. So that's just going to take the interpolation that we have on our first keyframe and our last keyframe, and it'll continue to carry that interpolation through the animation. So basically what's happening here, instead of it stopping at this keyframe and then beginning to scale up or down again based on what this last key is, it'll just continue to move through without skipping a beat. So that just makes it a little bit more of a fluid animation, and definitely helps you avoid the common mistake of just turning everything to easy ease and leaving it at that. So in this lesson, we learned how to quickly add variety to the animation of our blood splats, and we will be ready in our next lesson to combine this element with our scene. In this lesson, we will combine our blood we made in the last lesson and our zombie, and then animate them together. Okay, so we're right where we left off with our blood splatters. Let's go back out to our zombie main composition, and then just pull this down a little bit so we can continue to see this. And then we'll go over here to our comps folder, and now where we have created our blood splats comp, we want to make sure that that is in our comps folder, so it may have been added to another folder. We have it right there, so let's go ahead and get organized, drag that into the comps folder, and then we'll drag this from our comps folder in our project panel onto our zombie main composition comp and put it on our timeline behind our zombie layers. So go ahead and grab that, and we'll just put this right here behind the zombie 1 and 2 layer. So we sort of get this kind of a look with these all added together. Now, I want to drag this forward so that I don't begin to actually see this blood until my last zombie comes into my composition. So right here at the beginning of zombie 3 is where we want that blood splats layer to begin. So if you wanted to, you could move this up actually right underneath your zombie 3 layer. And that's really just up to you for that stacking order. You're not going to be able to see it before that point anyway. So now we sort of have this kind of a look where we begin to see these blood splats come in as our zombie has been fully revealed in our composition. And I want this to happen right behind where my zombie is standing. So let's go ahead and move it. I'm just holding shift to move it in a perfectly linear direction so it's not going too far up or down. And we kind of get this sort of a look. So it's sort of framing that zombie there. Now, the edge of my comp is causing my blood splat layers to be clipped. So I want to come over here and click my collapse transformation switch, which is the same switch as that continuously rasterized switch we used earlier, but it's only going to be called continuously rasterized for plain vector pieces of footage layers. Now for comp layers, like our blood splatters layer here, it's called collapse transformations. And all that means when we click this switch is look inside of my composition for the information to use. So I've clicked that and now I can see my blood splats a little bit better. So now I want to move my zombie again and move him over here to the right side of my composition so that I can maybe in a little while add some text down here in the lower left hand corner. Now, why would I move him at all? Why wouldn't I just put my text on this side? I just like the idea of my zombie looking towards my text rather than looking away from it. So it's just going to create a little bit more of a harmonious composition. And also, if you remember, we have the ability to animate his arm. So we may want to add that arm animation in, and we don't want it to be falling off the edge of our composition on this side. So after he's been here for about 4 frames, which is the same amount of time that our other clips were, if you remember, for zombie 1 and 2, let's go ahead and start that position animation. So I'm just going to put my current time indicator right here at the beginning of my zombie 3 layer and hit the P key to bring up my position. And then I'm going to hit page down 4 times. So at this point, I want him to start moving. So I'll go ahead and click my position stopwatch. And now I want him to move to the other side of my comp. So we'll move forward a few frames, probably somewhere around 12 frames, because we don't want our zombie to move too quickly. And 12 frames is about half the amount of frames we have in 1 second. So we have almost 24 frames per second for our frame rate. So 12 frames will be good and not make him look like he's moving too quickly. So I'm going to move forward 10 frames at a time by holding shift and hitting page down. So hitting page down by itself is just going to move you forward once. Holding shift and hitting page down will move you forward 10. Then I'll hit page down 2 more times to get me those 2 extra frames. And now that my current time indicator is at the place that I want to set my key, I'll go ahead and grab my zombie, hold shift just to move him in a perfectly linear direction, and we'll scoot him over here to the side. So I don't want him to be too close to the side, maybe just right about there where he has about the same amount of space on his side over here as he does between his head and the top. So that's just probably just gives him enough of a buffer that he doesn't feel too like there's too much tension between him and the sides of our composition. So we sort of have an animation that looks like this. Now I also want that blood to animate along with him. So I'm going to set a few keyframes for the blood as well. Now I could just parent those blood splatters to my zombie, but I don't want any of the other animation that I may add to my zombie to affect my blood splatters. I just want them to move behind him. So I'm not going to parent that just so that those other properties won't be attributed to the blood splats as well. So go ahead and click your blood splatters layer, hit the P key to bring up that position, and we'll move our current time indicator back there to that first keyframe that we set and hit our stopwatch. And now let's move forward to the keyframe that we set for our zombie and just hold shift and drag our blood splatters behind the zombie on this side. So we'll make sure that we still have him kind of in the middle of those, just right about there. So that gives us kind of an interesting composition, and now we can see these splats up here in the corner that we couldn't see earlier because our composition was sort of just falling off the edge there. So now as I kind of click through this, we get this kind of an animation, and the blood is following our zombie. Now I want to set a few more keys for my zombie, just like I was saying earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and select my zombie right there and hold Shift to bring up the scale option, and also hold Shift and hit the R key to bring up the rotation option. So now I have position, scale, and rotation properties all open. So I'm going to go ahead and set keys for the scale and rotation as they are on the second keyframe that I've created here. Now let's move forward all the way to the end of our comp, and let's change our zombie a little bit. So maybe by the end we want to make him a lot bigger. So I'm just going to scale this up here to something right about in there, and maybe now at this point also we have him moved over to the side a little bit more, so he continues to kind of scoot over in that direction. And then let's also rotate him a little bit so he starts to sort of be tilted up, so we sort of get this kind of a look there. So that just makes him a little bit more interesting as time continues to progress. And also I can go in here and hit the collapse transformation switch for my zombie 3, and I want to make sure that I go into my zombie 3 comp and that I have the continuously rasterize switch checked, so that as he continues to get bigger he will remain crisp. So come back out here, we see now that he looks nice and crisp even though he is well above 100% in scale. And I could also do the same thing for the scale of my blood splatters as well. So maybe we'll grab that blood splatters, hold Shift, hit the S key, and just on that first keyframe that we set for the zombie, go ahead and hit it for the blood splatters as well, just to set a scale keyframe there. And move forward, and maybe we'll scale up this blood to something like that. So that just continues to get bigger as a whole. Even though some of those other pieces are getting smaller inside of that comp, they look like they're just receding, even though the whole thing is getting bigger. So we can go ahead and do a RAM preview and just see what this looks like. And at this point, the changes that you're making are really up to you, and it's just really a matter of preference as far as if you want that to scale up or not. It's not necessarily right or wrong, just to add a little bit more variety to the keys that you've already set. So now that that RAM preview is done, we can just kind of watch that through. We see that we're transitioning really nicely from our live action footage to our zombie. And at this point, if your computer is still moving pretty quickly, you could go ahead and turn on motion blur if you wanted to, just to see what that looks like the rest of the way. Now, because I have my transformations collapsed on my zombie 3 layer, I need to go inside of that pre-composed layer to turn motion blur on there, and then turn it on for that comp as a whole. And same thing for the blood splatter. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on motion blur for all of those layers, turn it on for this comp as a whole. And we can again do the same thing for zombies 1 and 2. I'm not positive that they're going to be moving. I don't think we're going to end up adding any kind of movement to those, but if we do, it will be on for these as well. And if not, then it's not going to take up any extra processing power. But we do want to make sure that we have continuously rasterize checked for those layers, just in case, so that they continue to remain crisp. And now we can see that if I turn on my enable motion blur for all my layers, in this large movement that we see here, we definitely get some motion blur for our zombie and for our blood. And as long as you have motion blur turned on inside of those pre-comps, when you're in your main composition here, you can toggle the motion blur for everything on and off with this switch. So if your computer does start to slow down, you can obviously just switch this off, and that'll give you a little more processing power if you feel like you're losing a little bit of quality and time. So that's just really up to you, but that makes this transition here where we see him slide across our comp just happen a little bit more fluidly, and it looks a little bit better than the just sort of choppy thing that we were getting earlier. So I'm going to cut this RAM preview off a little bit early just so we can watch this with the motion blur. So we see him come in there, and that slide just looks a little bit better. Now, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and pull this scale key that we have here on our second keyframe back. So maybe he begins to scale during that slide, so there's not so many things happening all on that same key. And that's just really just a little tip for your animation, so it doesn't look like such a something happens, then something else happens, then something else happens, and it feels so compartmentalized. It's just going to feel a little more fluid by staggering those keyframes. So that's really up to you. Exactly the look that you're going for in the end is really going to be just chosen by how you arrange those keys. Okay, so in this lesson we combined our blood with our zombie, and we animated them to create a composition that's ready for another element. In this lesson, we will add our text and reveal it using another custom alpha. Okay, so let's go ahead and add our text layer. That's going to be over here in our graphics folder, and it's going to be here in the zombies attack layers folder. So drop that down, and that was just a PSD file that was imported as a composition to get those two layers, just as we did with our zombie translations layers. So go ahead and grab both of those and just drag them onto your composition. So I'm going to go ahead and lock my other layers for now, just so I'm not accidentally clicking something that I don't intend to, just because now I have a lot of different things I'm keeping track of. And I'm going to just start kind of reordering this text so I can read both of the layers. And right now they're pretty big, so let's scale them down a little bit just so they fit into our composition better. And just arrange this so it's sort of over here to the left of our zombie. So I don't want him to be, or I don't want the zombie text to be too close to the left side of my comp. So maybe give it almost as much space as we have between our zombie and this side of our comp. So there's just a little bit less space on this side. Now the attack, because it's a shorter word, maybe we want to scale this up a little bit and just make it fit under the zombies piece of text a little bit better. Maybe scoot this over just a little bit to stagger those, make it a little more interesting. So once you're happy with the way that those text layers have been arranged, you can pre-compose them together. So go ahead and select both of those layers and hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll just call this Zombies Attack. Okay, so now that text layer has just been combined into one layer, and I'm going to move this forward in time so that it happens about the same time as our final zombie pose. And actually I could move it forward even a little bit more if I wanted to where our zombie actually hits once he moves over to the other side of our comp. So I can unlock that zombie 3 layer and select that and hit the U key just to look at those keys. And if I put my current time indicator right on top of that, then I can just select my zombies attack layer, hold Shift, and drag it, and that's going to snap that to that point on my current time indicator. So this again is just helping me to order this a little bit better so I can just see where things are going to begin happening just based on the length of my layers and my timeline, so I don't have to look at my keys every single time. So whenever we created our custom alpha earlier, we had a reveal that just sort of happened all over our entire visual that we were looking at. But for the zombies attack, I want to create a custom alpha that kind of starts in between the layers and then shoots out, so it reveals zombies from the bottom and attack from the top. So we're going to create a custom alpha where the white is going to be configured in that way. So let's go ahead and create a new composition just like we did when we started out to create our last custom alpha. So come over here and hit this Create a New Composition button at the bottom of your project panel. And I'm going to name this unmirrored, and you'll see why I named it in this this in a moment. This is not going to be the main composition that we create for the custom alpha. This is just going to be a part of it. So unmirrored, and we'll leave all of these other settings the same for now. So now we just have our blank comp, and again I just want to add a white solid like I did for the last one. So go to layer, new, solid, and this white is fine. And now I want to add the effect CC particle world, and that's what we're going to be creating for the first part of our composition, to create that sort of look where we are getting a dissolve from bottom to top. So come over here to your effects and presets panel and type in CC particle, and just typing in CC par gives me these two options here. So I'm going to choose CC particle world for this one. Just grab that and drag it onto your solid. You can either do it in your composition window or on your timeline. So I'm going to start by just changing up some of my options here for my CC particle world effect. So the first thing I want to change is my particle type. So we'll come over here to particle and drop this one down. And it seems like a lot of times whenever I use CC particle world, I end up working from the bottom up. So I kind of have extras here, and I usually just start with particle and then work my way up from there as I change these things. So we'll come over here to particle type and change this to lens convex. So that's going to give you just a little bit of a different look than what you'd start out with for the lines that it defaults to. So we kind of get this sort of bubbly look here. Now let's change our physics. So I'm going to drop that one back up there and drop down physics. And for now, explosive is fine, but I'm going to change the gravity to be negative. So I'm going to come in here and change it to a negative 0.1. So if you have a hard time dragging that, you can just type it in negative 0.1, and that's going to give you this sort of a look right here. And right now it's a little bit hard to tell really exactly what's happening. You can see that the particles are definitely floating upwards, but I need to change my velocity to make this really apparent. So come in, click your velocity, and we're going to change that to a 0. So now my particles are going straight up. So we see that it almost looks like a little bit of a flame that we're getting right there. So now I'm going to go in and change my producer options. So we'll go ahead and drop this one down here. And my first thing that I want to change is the radius of my X value. So that is saying how wide I want these particles to be produced. So come in here and just turn this up so that it's happening all the way across your composition. So if you want it to be maybe somewhere like 850, something like that will be fine. And then I'm also going to change my Y position so that it's happening down here at the bottom of my comp. So just right along the bottom right there is going to be perfect. So 0.29 is really what I'm looking at. So if I scrub forward, kind of get this sort of a look where they're all coming up from the bottom and then just dissolving right there. Now I don't want them to dissolve quite so quickly, so I'm going to turn my birth rate up a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to have a lot more particles. We may want to turn this up somewhere right here around 13.3 or so. So I get quite a few particles where it's almost completely whited out here at the bottom. And I'm also going to turn up my longevity just a little bit as well, so they last just a little bit longer there. So that's what's actually going to change the point at which they start dissolving. So we get this kind of a look. And in fact, I could crank up that longevity even a little bit more if I want to. Maybe just make it go all the way off my entire comp there. So just right where it starts to completely fall off the top. Okay, so this is looking pretty good so far. I'm going to go ahead now at the beginning of my composition and set a key for my birth rate. So right here with my current time indicator at the very beginning, we're going to set our stopwatch. Now go ahead and click your layer and hit the U key just to bring that key up. And then now you'll be able to see how far forward you're going. And then right around here where we really start to almost fill up our whole composition, I'm going to crank that birth rate up even more to something just really high where it's almost completely whited out there at the bottom. So maybe somewhere right around 150. So now as I scrub forward and I keep going, we see this part here is almost completely whited out at the bottom. So that is going to give us that custom alpha that we were talking about in the last lesson, how we get this solid white look at the beginning and then it's fading out to black. But I also want to add another element to this custom alpha. And I'm going to do it just in the same way that we did last time with our turbulent noise. So for now, I'm just going to turn off my particle world solid. So we'll just turn this off here. Then come over here to effects and presets and type in turbulent noise again, or just noise. And let's go ahead and add another white solid to apply that effect to. So make sure you don't have anything selected. Go to new solid. A white one is fine. We'll put that there at the bottom. If you need to rename it just to keep it straight, right click it, go to rename. We'll call this noise. And you can rename this one particles. And then go ahead and grab that turbulent noise effect over here from effects and presets and drop it onto the noise layer. Okay, so now let's go ahead and have a little more fun with some of these other options that we didn't look at last time. Let's change this fractal type from basic to maybe something like dynamic. So this looks a little bit more smoky. That's just a little more interesting. And we can change our noise type to spline. Give that a little bit of a different look, just changing it from last time. And again, we'll go ahead and crank our contrast way up, something like 1600, so that we're just getting completely black blacks and completely white whites. And then now at the very beginning of our comp, we'll go ahead and turn the brightness all the way up so we have a completely white look here. And actually this time, maybe we want this to go to all the way to black at the beginning instead of white, just because of the way that our particles are set up. They're starting completely at black before they move to white. So we want to match those. So we'll turn this one actually down into the negative so it's starting at black. So this time we can use a little bit different of a track matte type just so you can see the different kinds that you can use. It really doesn't matter just as long as you're starting either on completely black or completely white. So let's go ahead and set a key here at the beginning for our brightness. And we'll go ahead and click our noise layer there, hit the U key so that we can look at that keyframe, and then we'll move forward to this same point here where we have the key for our particles. And we'll turn our noise up now in the other direction so that we get our completely white comp. So now we get something like this. Now maybe we want to add a little bit of variation to this new look as well. So we can come in here to the transform options. Maybe we'll add some rotation. So go ahead and set a rotation key there. Select that layer, hit the U key again a couple times just so you can see the key that you've set. We'll move that there to the beginning. You can move your current time indicator around if you want to, but putting it on the frame that you want to be able to set your key on is just going to make it where you can't really see what you're changing since we've already set those brightness keys. So I'm just having my current time indicator here in the middle and then moving the keys once they've been set. So now I'm going to just change that rotation a little bit and then move that to my last key so we get this sort of a look now. And maybe we want to turn up the complexity just as we did last time. So maybe turn that up to something around 20. And again, we can change our evolution. So I'll go ahead and set a keyframe at the evolution here and just double hit that U key to bring up the keyframe that we've set. And then we can just key the evolution a little bit to make this move. And so now we're getting a really interesting look there as we scrub that. So right now I have this happening at frame 36. So if you wanted to make this last longer, you could definitely move this forward. Let's just go ahead and move it forward to frame 75, about where we had it on our last frames whenever we were making our other custom alpha. So just to make those consistent. And again, we saw earlier that we could change the stretch to change that duration. Now let's look at both of these at the same time. So I'm going to turn back on my particles and scrub that there. So now we're getting this kind of a look. So pretty interesting, but it's only moving from one direction, from bottom to top. And we're wanting to also reveal the middle, from the middle of our two words. So I want to be able to see attack as well as zombie. So right now, if I just put this over zombie, it would only reveal zombie. So let's go ahead and use this composition in the main composition that we'll create for this custom alpha. So let's go back over here to our project panel and go ahead and hit that new composition button again. And we'll call this one middle reveal. So kind of similar to basic reveal, we'll call this one middle reveal. Go ahead and hit OK. And now we'll grab that unmirrored comp that we just created and drop that onto our timeline. So now if we scrub that, it looks just the same as it did earlier, but now we have everything that we created contained inside of this composition. And now what I'm going to do is just hold my layer by clicking it, also hold Shift, and then drag it up. So I'm going to drag it to about the middle right there. So now I have this sort of a look. And now to mirror this, I'm just going to duplicate my layer. So hit Control D and grab my rotation tool up here and turn this completely upside down. And I'm just going to hold Shift to snap that into place. Now grab your selection tool and we'll just drag this layer down and overlap it with our other layer. So now we have this sort of a look. So we're getting just kind of this look where everything is coming out from the middle. So this is going to be what we use as our custom alpha to reveal our text. Okay, so let's go ahead and set that up really quickly. Go back out here to your main zombie composition, and we'll just grab that middle reveal comp that we just created and drag that on top of our zombies attack text. Now we can move this forward in time so that it's happening right at the same time that our zombie attack text does. And I'm going to go ahead and scale it down so that it's about the same size as my piece of text. Now this is what I did earlier. I just did it after I had already set the track mat. So this is just so you can see a little bit better the edges that we've created and make sure that it's wide enough. So I want to make sure that this origination point for my particles is right in between my two words. So right about there. And if you want to, you can go ahead and hit this layer, hit the T key, maybe turn your opacity down just so that you can see where you're positioning this a little bit better. And then we'll go ahead and once we get that in place, turn the opacity back up to 100. And now we'll just go in and choose the track mat that we need to use it to reveal our text. And this time, instead of using the Luma inverted mat, we'll just use a regular Luma mat. So now we get this sort of an effect where we're starting out without anything visible, but then we start to sort of see a little bit of our text right there. As we scrub forward, our text is being revealed there from the middle in sort of this bubbling on sort of version there. So really interesting, a lot different from what we did the first time, even though we used a lot of the same technique as far as just getting that solid black and solid white at the beginning and end. And you can definitely go in and change the timing if you feel like this is happening a little bit too slowly. You can come in and make this happen a little bit more quickly. So maybe we want this to happen over a matter of 12 frames. So we can start here at the beginning, hold Shift, hit page down, then go forward 2 more. And so we know at this point we want it to be fully revealed. So I can just drag this backwards until I see all of my zombies attack text being revealed. So right about there. And that's just a really quick and handy little way so I don't have to go in and actually adjust any of my keyframes. Now, one of the things that happens whenever you use a Luma mat is that it's going to disappear after this layer ends. So one of the things I need to do is go ahead, grab my zombies attack layer and hit Control-Shift-D like we did in one of those very first lessons, just to trim that and put that above this layer. And now I have my zombies attack text that's just going to continue after it's been fully revealed. So that's just one of the differences whenever you're using a track that starts from black to white instead of white to black, because it's no longer going to be revealed by this layer, since this layer ends before we want our zombie text layer to go away. So that's just one little extra step you have to do that may end up changing in the future which way you end up setting up your alpha if you're going to go from black to white or white to black. So in this lesson, we learned how to create a slightly more complex custom alpha to use for our text. In this lesson, we will add another blood element to make our text a little more readable against our background. Okay, so right now, my text isn't necessarily unreadable against my background, but I could highlight it a little bit more by using one of these blood splatter elements and just placing it behind my text. So one of the ones that I really like the way that it just interacts with the things behind it is the splatter -05. So let's go in here to your graphics folder, and really quickly, if you are having this issue where your comps are not going into your comps folder, go ahead and select those, drag them in there just to stay organized, so if you need to find them later, you can. So we'll come over here into that graphics folder and grab this blood splatter -05, and let's drag this right behind our zombies attack text. So we're going to do it behind all three of these layers that we've used. And I'm just going to trim this to be the same length as my layers. And I'll go ahead and solo this one just so you can see which one it is. And this is just one of the ones that looks like a smear. So let's go ahead and rotate this so it will be sort of the same linear configuration as our text. And then grab your selection tool and we'll just scale this up. And you want to make sure that you are continuously rasterizing that so that remains clear. And again, we may want this just to be a little bit bigger. And we'll just keep rotating that till that looks a little bit better. Okay, so now I'll unsolo that, and we see how this is interacting with our background. So really you can just scale this however you like. I'll maybe make it a little bit skinnier there, even though I want it to be long. And just continue moving this. And I'm holding Shift as I want it to constrain proportionally, but once you start to squeeze it down in one direction, you may not want to hold Shift anymore or you'll lose that information. So this looks pretty good right there. It's mostly covering the whole part of my text in the background there. So this is a good size for me. And one of the things that I could do, maybe if I want to continue to be able to see through this mask or this piece of blood splatter here, is just to change the blending mode. So I already have my blending modes open, so I'll be able to see which one it's been set to right there. I'm just going to hold Shift and hit the plus key to cycle through those blending modes. And actually, I want to make sure that I'm doing it to the blood splatter layer. So you want to have this layer selected right there. And hold the Shift key just to cycle through those. And that one's pretty interesting right there when it's on multiply. So it gets a lot darker than some of our other layers and interacts with our zombie drawing pretty nicely. So I like the way that that looks. Now, something that I want to do is really just to add this blood splat almost like it is revealed on sort of maybe like our zombie's hand went across this, or something else slid across this to reveal this blood. So let's unmask this blood instead of it just popping onto our composition. So I want to go ahead and create a mask around this layer. So select your layer and come up here and grab your pen tool. And now we'll just draw a box kind of a shape around the blood layer. So get something like this. And right now this is set to add mode, which is what we want. And by the time probably that our zombies attack text is revealed to about this point, we want this blood to be fully on our composition. So I'm going to go ahead and set a mask path key at this point. So go ahead and grab that blood layer that has the mask drawn on it and twirl this down. And we'll go ahead and set our mask path key right there. And now move your current time indicator to the beginning of that layer. And we will start to move these keys backwards. So I'm going to just double click these and start to kind of scale this back in this direction. Now, because I double clicked that, it put a box around the whole mask, and I didn't want this one to go up quite so high. So I'm just dragging this one point back down there so it's more in this sort of a shape. So now let's just use our page down key to kind of slowly key through that, and we'll see how this is being revealed. So that's pretty interesting there. Now maybe something I want to do is add another point here in the middle of my mask so that maybe I get a little bit more of an irregular line instead of this perfectly straight line. So come up here, grab your pen tool and go to your add vertex tool. So just drag down to that one and we'll just click right there in the middle. I'm going to come back up here to my pen tool and grab my convert vertex tool. And now I'm just clicking that and dragging that out to give it a little bit of a twist there. Okay, so that looks pretty interesting. Now maybe I can add a little bit of a feather to this mask. So I'm just dragging this out here so that looks a little more feathered instead of such a stark, hard edge. So now I'm just going to use those page down keys again to continue to reveal this. So that's pretty interesting there as that moves across time. Now, maybe we want the interpolation of these keys to change a little bit. So I can go ahead and select all of those, hit the F9 key just to give that the easy ease. And then again, we don't want it to stop once we get to this key in the middle. So I'm just going to hold Control and double click that key there to give it the auto Bezier interpolation, just so it's using the interpolation from the beginning and end of my keyframe configuration. So that's just going to give it a little bit different interpolation than that plain linear look. And we can add motion blur there, so turn that motion blur switch on, and that's just going to add a little bit more blur to it even than we were getting with the blur in our mask. So that just helps to make the whole thing just a little bit more readable and interesting, just kind of giving it a backing plate there. So in this lesson, we reused one of our blood splatter elements and used a mask to make it look as if it shot across our composition. In this lesson, we will animate our zombie's arm to look like it's pointing in the direction of our text. Okay, so earlier we had talked about animating our zombie's arm, and now is about the time that I want to do that. So I'm getting my text here, and I want my zombie almost to look like he's pointing at this text. So we'll come up here to our zombie 3 layer, and about the time when he hits the side of the comp is when I want his arm to start animating up. So let's grab that zombie 3 layer and hit the U key to look at all those keyframes. And it looks like it's right here on frame 72 that this begins. So I'm going to, with my current time indicator at this point, go into this pre-composed zombie 3 layer and start my animation from that point. So we'll double click this. And I'm just going to go ahead and set a marker at this point so I can remember that this is the point where I want that animation to start. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that asterisk key with my current time indicator at that point. And now we can go ahead and grab the arm layer, which looks like it's going to be this layer here on top. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename that so it's a little bit easier for me to keep track of. So I'll right click my layer, hit rename, and type in arm. And then we can rename this bottom one just to zombie. So now I want to have my zombie's arm rotate up. So right now he's in this downward rotation position. So I can go ahead and just hit the R key to start that. And right now you see that if I start to rotate it, he's not rotating from the shoulder. And that's because, just as we learned in our blood splatter lesson, my rotation point is way over here. So I need it to be at this point where I want his arm to rotate from. So we'll come up here and grab my pan behind anchor point tool. And we'll just drag the anchor point right on top of this area where we want his arm to rotate from. And now if I drag that, it looks as if his arm is actually rotating from its socket. So I'm going to undo that rotation, and we'll go ahead and just set a key right here at the beginning with his arm in the down position. So we'll set that rotation stopwatch right there. And now I want this to happen over a pretty good amount of time. So maybe over about 1.5 seconds, which is going to be somewhere around 30 frames. So let's just hold our shift key and hit the page down key 3 times to move forward 30 frames. And now let's just rotate that arm upwards to where he's really just creating a parallel line here with his body, or a perpendicular line with his body. So we see that that's just coming straight out of his body right there. So as we scrub that, you can see that we just sort of get this slow, sort of creepy point that he's doing. And I can change the interpolation here, so he maybe slowly begins to do this, then it gets a little faster and then slower again, just by changing both of these to easy E. So I can just select both of those keyframes and hit F9 to change that. So that's just going to be a little bit more interesting than regular linear keyframes. So now let's go back over to our zombie main composition and just see how that interacts with the rest of our comp. So I'm going to just start right about here, hit the B key, and then hit the 0 key on my number pad to watch a RAM preview. Okay, so now that that RAM preview is complete, we can watch this through and just see the timing that we've created here with our zombie's arm animation. So that's just really a little more interesting than just the static setup that we had before. And if you want this to happen over a little bit more of a long amount of time, we can scrub forward here, go back inside of that zombie 3 composition and move this keyframe forward. So this is happening over longer than 30 frames now, just so that that continues to animate through the rest of our composition. So we'll come back out to our main composition, and I can just scrub that to watch that transformation. And just by doing a quick RAM preview, I can watch that new animation that we've created with this slower arm movement, and that just maybe looks a little bit more interesting than the arm quickly popping up there. So we just have this slow movement of his arm raising as time progresses. So in this lesson, we learned how with the smart setup we initially did in our Illustrator file, animating the arm of our zombie was pretty easy. In this lesson, we will add some finer blood particle sprays behind our zombie. So when the zombie hits the last pose right here, and he hits on the right side of our composition, let's just add a little punctuation to that spot with some particles that look like blood. So I want to go over here and just grab this mistparticles.psd and drag this onto my composition so you can just kind of see what this looks like here. And we'll place it behind our zombie's head. So right now it's on top, but I just want to center it there behind where my zombie's head is at. And then I want to change the color of this so it looks a little bit more like blood. So I'm going to go over here, go to Window, open up my Effects and Presets panel. You may still have yours open from earlier, and just type Tint in right here. So T-I-N-T. And then just grab that from underneath color correction and drop that onto your mist particles layer. Now at first that's not going to change the coloring of anything because we need to map our black and white values. So that's why I already have this set to black and white. So let's go ahead and say that our white values will be kind of the red blood color. So I'm going to grab this white eyedropper and we'll just choose a red color there. And then we'll map our black to maybe like this dark purple color right in there. So that changes that just a little bit. Or you could even do maybe a brown color, something like that. So that could be interesting as well. So that's really up to you what you want that to look like. Or you could do another really dark red, just something like that. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to change this. Whenever we duplicated that zombies attack layer earlier, there was not a layer above it. So that was still set to a Luma track matte. So go ahead and change that to no track matte so that your mist particles layer is just normal. And then we'll drop that beneath our zombie 3 layer. So that's just behind his head. And now I want to go ahead and change the scale of my layer so that it kind of animates out or shoots out right as he hits that point. So right here where this keyframe is on our zombie 3 layer, let's go ahead and drag this layer, the mist particles layer, so it begins at that point. And now let's just open up our scale property. So with that layer selected, hit the S key. And now let's just type in 0 for that value. So it starts out without us seeing anything, and we'll just set our keyframe at that point. And now maybe after about 6 or 7 frames, so we'll just go forward in time a little bit there, we can begin to scale that up and see how big we really want this to be. Maybe not quite to 100% at this point, maybe something around 75. So it just kind of splats right there behind his head. And now I can even move forward a little bit more in time and make this get bigger. So maybe at that point, maybe not quite that big, maybe something just like 100% at that point. So it continues to grow, but we really see that main hit happen right there at the beginning. So I can go ahead and change these to the easy ease style keyframes just by selecting all those, hitting F9. And then again, this key we want to go ahead and set to auto bezier. So select it, hold Control, and click it twice. So that's going to be interesting. And we can go ahead and turn on motion blur for that layer, just so during that scale we see kind of that blurriness behind him. So it really feels like that's just shooting out there. And I also want to add a few little secondary particles that are actually going to continue on past this layer that's just the solid image layer that we're using. So we're going to do that using CC Particle World, just as we did earlier when we created that alpha channel. We'll use the same effect. So go ahead and go up to Layer, New, Solid, just so we have something to add that particle world to. And we can do this one, it's fine for it just to be a white solid for now. Say okay to that. And this is going to happen right on top of that mist particles layer. So just drop that there for now. And then we'll go over to our effects and presets, and we're going to type in CC Particle World. And we'll drop that onto that white solid layer. Now, right now, it doesn't matter yet exactly where this is going to be happening as far as my beginning of my layer. So I'm just going to leave it this length of my comp for now, because we're going to change all of these settings here in a moment. So I still want to be able to see my composition here so I can see what's happening with these particles. And in fact, I'm going to actually solo this layer for now, just so I'm only seeing my particle layer. And if I want to, I can turn on this toggle transparency mode if I feel like I need to see this a little bit better, maybe in a moment whenever we start changing this particle around, what this actually looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and go over here to my particle option here in my effects and controls panel. And I'm going to change my particle type first, just like I did last time. But instead of doing lens convex, we're going to change this to textured square. What textured square allows me to do is to designate a custom particle. So I've created a custom particle, and it's over here in my project panel. So we'll click this and look inside of our graphics folder here. Go all the way down to this area. We see spray particle 1 and 2. So I'm going to use spray particle 1 for this first one. And this is a red particle that just kind of looks like this splat. And one of the weird things about the way that these particle systems work is that whenever you designate a custom particle, it can't just remain over here in your project panel. It has to be on your timeline. So I'm going to grab this and actually drag it down here to the bottom of my timeline and just turn it off. So I'm not actually seeing this layer, but now my particle world will be able to recognize it. So we'll come back up here. Go ahead and grab that white solid again that is your blood splatter. or your blood mist. And then we'll come up here to the effects controls, and now we have this option here for the texture. So we'll drop this down and choose our texture layer to be spray particle 1. So now we see we get these special particles that we've created, and we are just designating those by having that layer on our timeline. So while I'm here in my particle options, I'm going to come down here to the birth and death size of my particle and make this just a little bit bigger. So maybe about 0.44. And I'm just going to have that be the same size for both. So just crank that up a little bit there. And now let's go ahead and change our physics. So I'll go ahead and twirl that particle back up and twirl down my physics. And it's okay for my animation to remain explosive at this point, but I am going to change my velocity. So I'm going to crank my velocity up to something like 3.8, maybe 8.6, somewhere right in there, 8.5. So these particles are going to be moving really fast. And that's just because we want them to really feel like they shoot out whenever our mist particles hits on that scale key. So another thing I want to do is turn my gravity off, because these are just going to shoot straight out. I don't want them to be affected by gravity, so we'll turn that to a 0. And now let's change our producer option. So I'm going to twirl back up physics, twirl down producer. And one of the first things that I want to change is the position. So right now my position is kind of just sitting right there in the middle of my comp. So I'm going to scoot this over. So it's going to be closer to behind my zombie, and then we can scoot this up to somewhere right in about there. So it's right about the same point as where that mist particles layer is at. And you can unsolo that if you want to really tweak that further and just get it right behind the head of your zombie. So I'm just kind of moving this just so this little ball right there is right behind my zombie's head. I'm going to solo that again just so I can see those particles a little bit more clearly by themselves. Okay, now I also am going to change the radius just a little bit. So my Z radius, I'm going to crank up so we're getting just a little more variation there in my Z depth. So somewhere right in there around 655 is good for that. Okay. Now we're going to work on the part where we're going to really make it look like this explodes out really quickly and then cuts off. So a lot of times with the particle world, you get this sort of look where they just continue on and on and on. So I'm going to show you how to set up your keys so that you just get a quick burst and then they stop. So right over here around frame 69 or so, which is just a little bit before this hits. So if you want it to maybe be just a little bit before that, so maybe 70, right before this begins, where we see this mist particles layer, is where we're going to set our first key. And we're going to set our key with our birth rate. So we're going to first change our birth rate to a 0. So right up here, change this value to 0. And also I want to set a key at this point. So once this is set to 0, go ahead and hit that stopwatch. And you can also select your layer and hit the U key just so you can see where that key was set. Now we're going to move forward only one frame here. So I'm just moving forward from frame 70 to 71, and we're going to crank our birth rate up. So at this point, we'll crank it up to something like 8. So this is going to be a really high birth rate compared to just the default value. So we're going to shoot out quite a few particles, and they're going to happen just in one frame like that. And now I'm going to move forward just a couple more frames. So right now we're at 71, so maybe 73, and we're going to turn our birth rate back down to 0. So all the way down to 0 there. So if I zoom in, we see that this change happens over a matter of 4 frames. So really quickly. And as I just move through there, you really get to see this change here happening where we just get this quick burst and then we have no more particles. Now, something that you notice is that the particles begin to dissolve before they fully make it off screen. So I'm going to crank up my longevity so I can continue to see those. And I'm just going to crank it up there somewhere around 3.4 or so that they continue off the screen and I can see them for most of the rest of that time that they're on there. Now at that point it would probably be too long, so 3.4 is pretty good. So I'm just scrubbing through there to kind of see what that looks like, and if you want to, you can come back in here and turn off that solo switch and just see what that looks like if you want to scrub that. So right now this looks a little choppy, so we can turn on motion blur for this layer and we just see how fast those particles actually are coming out from behind our zombie. Just scrub that right there. You may need to do a RAM preview, so you can just come back here right before the zombie hit the B key, and then I'm just going to hit the 0 on my number pad to kind of see how those particles come out there. So that looks pretty good. You may want to crank up your velocity even a little bit more because this feels like they're kind of just slowly floating out there. So maybe come back in here to your physics, turn up your velocity, and do another RAM preview just to take a look at that change. So there they really feel like they're coming out more quickly, and that's really just up to you how fast you want those particles to shoot out from there. That looks pretty good, maybe even a little bit faster. You don't want it to be so fast that they're just a blur, but you want it to be fast enough that it's convincing that there was actually an explosion that happened there. So you can just continue cranking that up, and that's going to just keep making it look faster and faster as you change that velocity there. So that's pretty good right there. Once I crank that up to about 10, I'm really able to see those particles shoot across the screen. So that's up to you. You can tweak that as much as you want. Now, maybe I want to add a little bit of variation to this. So what I can do is grab my particle world and duplicate it. So I'm just going to hit Control D to duplicate that. And just to kind of keep in mind what layer is what, instead of naming this white solid, I'm going to right click that, go to rename, and we'll call this particle 1. And then the second one here I'm going to name particle 2. So rename particle 2. And now with my particle 2 selected, I'm going to go in and change it up. And really it's just going to be a similar look to what we had before, but just add a little bit of variation. So come back over here to your project panel, and you'll notice that we have 2 spray particle types. So this second one is kind of more of a white looking particle. So we'll grab this, put it on our timeline next to our first particle, turn off the eyeball just so that we're not actually seeing it. We're just going to refer to it. And with your particle 2 layer selected here, go back over to your controls panel and drop down the particle option, and we'll change the texture from particle 1 to particle 2. So now if we move back to where this change is happening, we see that we have just a little bit of variation in that particle type. So we're getting kind of this sort of a look. And you can come over here to your opacity map and change your birth color. Maybe you want this to just be solid white instead of that more yellow color, and then they'll change to red over time. So this just maybe looks a little bit more like a variation in that particle than the red one that we had earlier. So even though it's white, it's moving so fast that it appears just to be some other type of matter besides the red particle system that we have for our other layer. And maybe you want to go in and change the particle size. So maybe it starts out at 0.07 and ends up at a 0.02. So again, that's just going to add a little bit more variation. You can come down here to your extras option and change your seed, and that is just going to change the seed to happen. So all the settings will be the same, but it'll just generate different particles in a different position based on that being a different random seed. So that's just a little more interesting than having those happen right on top of each other with the same timing. So now we can see both of those sets of particles, the red, and we'll be able to see the white as well. So again, just adding a little more interest. And if you feel like these particles are a little too hard for you to see, for the white particles. I can see one just right there, super, super tiny. You can come in here and turn up the size a little bit, and that's going to make them just a little bit more visible. So really, this is just up to you how small you actually want them, because you don't want them to overpower the red particles. These white ones are really just another type of matter that we're seeing there. That's really just up to you how you want those to look, but just adding some variation by having those two particle systems is just a little more interesting. So in this lesson, we learned how to animate our particles to look like a fine spray of blood and guts to really punctuate our zombies' move from left to right. In this lesson, we will learn how to add a few more grunge textures and animate them using expressions. Okay, so I want to add just a few more grunge textures to my composition here. So if we go over here to our graphics folder, we see that we have a couple more textures that we haven't used yet. So I'm going to go ahead and use this concrete noise layer. So go ahead and grab this one, and I'm just going to drag this beneath my mist particles layer. And you may need to open this up so you can see this a little bit better. Beneath my mist particles layer and above my blood splatters layer. So it's just right in between. And I want to go ahead and change the blending mode of this just so that I can see my background a little bit better. So just to cycle through those with that layer selected, hold shift and hit the plus key. And some of these are a little extreme, so you just want to find one that looks good with the rest of your layers. Overlay mode right there, I like the way that that looks. So this is going to just add a little bit of variation over those blood splats that we had earlier that just looked like really smooth vector layers. So this just makes that a little bit more grungy. Now I want to figure out a way to introduce this, because if I scrub backwards in my timeline, we're seeing this layer the whole time throughout the beginning whenever we have just this footage layer here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up with a mask. So let's draw a mask on our layer. With my layer selected, I'm going to come up here and grab my pen tool. And I'm just going to draw a vignette kind of shape in an ellipse like you normally would see, but I want it to be varied. So just come in here and sort of start drawing a kind of squiggly line here in the shape of an ellipse. Now this is going to give me a really hard edge, so I'm going to go into those mask options and change those up a little bit. So feather my mask, and maybe once that's been feathered, expand it just a little bit. So now what I'm going to do is key this so that it scales up as my change begins to happen. So right about here, once this begins changing, I'm going to set my first scale key. So go ahead and select your layer, hit the S key just to open up your scale property, and we'll turn this to a 0. So we can't see it at all at this point. And then we'll hit our stopwatch just so that we set that first key. And then as we move forward about right here where our transition is complete, we'll go ahead and scale that back up to 100%. So just type in 100 and hit enter. So we see that that interacts pretty interestingly with this grunge layer that we already have. So it just adds a little more variation. And I can go ahead and turn motion blur on for that layer as well, just to make that look a little bit more realistic. Now I also want to change the position and rotation with an expression. So that's just going to make it look like it's kind of wiggling around, which is actually the name of the expression that we're going to be using. So I want to open up the position and rotation properties for my grunge layer. So with my layer selected, hit the P key, hold shift, and also hit the R key. So it's going to bring up both of those properties at the same time. Now when you want to add an expression, all you have to do is hold Alt and click the stopwatch for the property you want to add the expression to. So I'm holding Alt, and I'm just going to first click the position stopwatch. So that puts me into this mode where I can't see my composition window because my refresh is disabled. And if I move anything besides my layer that has the dialog box in it, it's going to take me out of that expression mode. So to get back into it, now that I've clicked that, I can just double click this piece of text and type in this area here. So the expression we're going to be using is called wiggle. So I'm just going to type in wiggle, all lowercase. And now we're going to add some values. So the two values that we add are the frequency and the amplitude. The frequency says how many times within my frame rate I want this to happen. So I want this to happen 1 time per second. And that would mean I would insert a number 1. So we'll put a number 1 right there. And then I'm going to separate that value from my next value with a comma. And then my next value that I'll add is my amplitude, which means units of my property. So for my position, it will just be pixels. So I'll put another 1 right there. And I'll close that with a close parentheses. So this expression says every second move 1 pixel. So that's going to be a really small change. So we may end up wanting to crank this up a little bit higher since we already have such a grungy texture, but for now we'll just leave this at wiggle 1, 1. And now I want to go ahead and add the same expression to my rotation, but we may change up the values a little bit. So come in here and hold Alt and click your rotation stopwatch, and we'll type in wiggle again, open parentheses, and this time I'll do a 5. So 5 times per second I want this to happen, and we'll put a comma, and then we can put a 2. So 2 degrees. Since this is no longer pixels, it's measured by degrees since it's rotation. So at 5 times every second I want my layer to rotate by 2 degrees is what those values mean. So we'll go ahead and close that off with close parentheses and just click anywhere to get out of that mode. And I'm just going to move forward here in time where we have a little bit less movement happening in our composition. Hit the B key to trim my work area to my current time indicator. And I'll move forward a little bit and hit the N key. So we're just getting a little place here to sample what we've created. And now I'll just watch a small RAM preview just so I can see the expression and how it's been applied to that layer. So already you can see that just kind of moving back and forth there. And it's pretty subtle. We're not seeing really a lot of position change, but definitely the rotation is giving us some movement there. So that just adds a little bit more interest, and it's pretty random. So we're able just to look at this and not really feel like it's something that we set a lot of keys for. So this is a good time to use an expression that's just going to give you a random value when you're doing something really grungy and twitchy like this. So let's go ahead and do this for our other layer as well. So I have not yet added this grunge scratches layer. So I'm going to add this just on top of everything. So we see this layer right there has been just dropped on top. And let's go ahead and make this one smaller as well. I'm going to come up here, grab my selection tool, and scale this down just to fit my comp size a little bit better. Make it a little bit less blurry. And I want to give myself some margin again because that rotation wiggle that we're going to add needs a little bit of an edge. And we can go ahead and change the blending mode for this layer as well. So again, I'm just going to select my layer and hold the Shift key and hit plus to cycle through some of the different blending options that I get. And some of these definitely are a little bit too extreme. Overlay is pretty interesting, but it might be a little bit much still, so we can go in and edit this with its transparency a little bit. And that's also a great way for us to introduce this layer. Instead of maybe drawing a mask this time, we simply want to introduce this by keying its transparency. So at this point right here where our zombie hits its final pose, let's go ahead and hit the T key on our grunge layer. We'll turn our opacity all the way down to 0. And again, this is a good time to clip your layer. So just hold the Alt key and hit that beginning bracket or open bracket key. And then we will click our opacity stopwatch to set that keyframe. And then I'm just going to click forward here to about this same point where our second position key was added for zombie 3. And we'll turn this up to something like 80% opacity since it did look a little extreme. And that still might be a little bit too much. So maybe somewhere like 45%. So we're just getting a really subtle overlay on top of our zombie, and it really just helps to tie together the colors of our zombie and the colors of our text. So we're getting this nice effect where everything has this on top of it. Now we can go ahead and add some more position and rotation wiggle to this layer. So go ahead and select your layer, hit the P key, hold Shift, and hit the R key. And I will just Alt click that position stopwatch. Now maybe this time we want to change the position wiggle to be a little more extreme than what we had on our last layer. So type in wiggle, open parentheses, and this time we can do a 2, 2. So that's saying 2 times every second I want this to move 2 pixels. So maybe even a 2 is too small. Maybe we want it to move 5 pixels. So we'll definitely be able to see this wiggle for this layer. And then let's add a little bit for our rotation. So hold Alt, click the rotation stopwatch, type in wiggle, open parentheses, and this one we can do something more subtle than the other rotation we had. So maybe we'll do a 1, 2, close parentheses. And now we'll just RAM preview a little section right here, just like we did earlier, by just hitting that 0 key on our number pad. We'll be able to watch this animate. So this has a little bit more of a subtle movement, but we can definitely still see the animation that's more extreme for the layer behind it. So that's just adding a little more variation again. And now we can go ahead and actually watch a RAM preview of our entire comp. So I'm going to go ahead and drag my work area there to the very beginning and very end, and just kind of make this a little bit bigger there so I can see the whole area. And then I'll hit that 0 key to RAM preview through. Okay, my RAM preview is complete, and I can just watch that animate through. So pretty interesting composition that we've created there with our zombie transitioning from our live footage. And you can definitely go in there and adjust any of the timing that you may want to change if you feel like maybe that explosion happens a little bit late, or maybe you want his arm to move a little bit differently. You can always go in and just tweak a few of those keyframes now that we have those set up. You can just drag them to move that around at all. But for now, I'm pretty happy with the way that this has turned out. So in this lesson, we finished out our zombie animation and topped it off with a few final animated grungy textures.